I'm LaVern Vivio from the Blaze TV, and this is Wide Awake. It's Christmas, and no matter what you think about the holiday, whether you think it should be secular or holy, the one thing that is without question is the reason for this season. The reason we have a Christmas day, a Christ Mass day, is because of the life of Jesus. But what do we really know about him? And I'm not talking about what we know about him from this, not from the Bible. I'm saying set this aside for a second. Then what do you know about the man? The man that for most of us literally changed the way we mark time. Now, I'm a huge fan of archaeology. I find it fascinating that we can take a tiny fragment from an ancient text or an inscription from an ancient artifact and find proof of life for those who lived before us. So with that in mind, is there proof of life of Jesus? Let's take a look. And let's start with somebody I bet you've heard of, Josephus. He was a Jewish historian in the 1st century and wrote a history about 60 years after Jesus died. For believers, they consider the work of Josephus absolute verification of everything that they believe in the New Testament. But for non-believers, they think it proves that ancient documents can be tampered with, and so they don't trust it. They believe it looks suspicious. And the reason why, let me explain, is because what we know about Josephus is that he was somebody that wanted to find favor with Rome. He wanted the Roman officials to like him. And so people who are non-believers say, if you look at what Josephus writes, it is not consistent with somebody who wanted Rome to like them. Because he writes that there was a man, Jesus. He was a wise man, if you can call him a man. He writes at one point, Jesus, he was the Christ. He writes about the resurrection. All things that somebody that wanted to find favor with Rome would not have written, and so they don't trust it. They cast it aside as though he never wrote anything about Jesus. But what they fail to mention, and maybe they don't even realize, is that's not the only time Josephus writes about Jesus. It's kind of in passing, but he writes later on when he mentions the death of James, the brother of the so-called Christ. And he also mentions Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, when he writes about how that the Jewish people felt that Herod was being punished for beheading John the Baptist when his army was defeated by a rival army. So Josephus wrote about Jesus and considered him a significant historical figure, and he was not the only one. Tacitus did as well, about 20 years after Josephus. He is the one who wrote about Nero setting fire to Rome and blaming the Christians. He also wrote about how the Christians were severely persecuted, and he wrote that Pilate was the one who ordered Jesus' execution. But one of the coolest things in his text was where he mentions a superstition that was repressed for a time but broke out again. A superstition that was being passed around about the time of the crucifixion that many historians believe was a reference to the stories of the resurrection that were being passed through the area. Now, the historians were not the only ones to write about Jesus. The ancient Romans also had their own version of Bill Maher. He was a Greek satirist that was named Lucian, and he did not like the Christians. As a matter of fact, when you read what he wrote, you can almost hear a mocking tone in his words. Listen to this. He said, "The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws." I mean, you can hear the disdain. You can hear the mocking tone in his words, and I think it's hysterical that his words are one of the best pieces of evidence we have of the early Christians and the life of Jesus Christ. And one more I want to share with you comes about 180 years after Christ died. And it is actually from a Christian historian, and it's not so much what he wrote, but who he quotes. His name was Julius Africanus. And he quotes in his work a couple of historians that lived during the time of the crucifixion that just couldn't imagine what could have caused the darkness that came over the land at the time of the crucifixion. And they speculate that it had to have had something to do with an eclipse. But then Africanus makes the point that, you know, we know when eclipses are going to happen. The sun and the moon have to be in the right alignment, and it simply was not the case at that time. An eclipse would have been impossible. So it's fun to look back at all this. And if you want to dig deeper, go and look at my notes, and you can see all my sources. You can go to LaVernVivio.com. click on the free PDF, Constitution of Faith, and about page 27, I look into the historical Jesus, and you'll find all my sources, including Josh McDowell, my favorite source for this kind of material, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and another great source. This is the Archaeological Bible from Zondervan, and it is fantastic. And as a matter of fact, they make a great point. They sum all this up, and I kind of alluded to it a while ago when they said that, you know, so many people of ancient history would be completely lost to us if it weren't for just one mention in ancient text or one inscription on an ancient artifact. So when you consider that and you look at the evidence for Jesus, it is more than sufficient to see the proof of Jesus Christ, and not just to see the proof that he lived, but in my opinion lived a life so profound and significant to literally change time. So Merry Christmas, or Merry Christmas. God bless, and Las Dio, y'all.